Number 5. Last night, a friend hurried me out of the house to catch the opening act at a local bar's music night. After having a few drinks, I realized my phone was missing from my pocket. I searched the table where we were sitting, the bar, and the bathrooms, but had no luck finding it. So, I used my friend's phone to call mine. After 2 rings, someone picked up, let out a low, raspy laugh, and hung up. They didn't answer when I tried again. Eventually, I gave up, thinking it was lost for good, and headed home. I found my phone lying on my nightstand, right where I'd left it. Number 4. When I was a kid, I was always the last one to get picked up by the school bus. One day, while waiting alone, a bus with no other kids on board pulled up. The driver smiled and told me to hop on. Something just felt off, so I asked, "Where are the other kids?" He replied that we'd pick them up next and insisted I get on. As he became more pushy, I kept refusing, though he didn't do anything extreme. Eventually, he shrugged and drove off. The real bus arrived a few minutes later, and I went to school. My parents didn't know what happened, so I mentioned it that night. Looking back, they seemed pretty worried and quickly made some phone calls. Number 3. A few years ago, I rented an apartment from a friend who had recently bought and renovated it. He had it up for sale but couldn't find a buyer, so I decided to rent it in the meantime. After moving in, I noticed something off about the woman next door. She looked about 45 but seemed much older. She stayed up all night, listening to Christian radio shows and talking loudly to someone. It got so bad that I couldn't sleep, so I went over to ask her to keep it down. When she opened the door, I caught a glimpse inside. Her walls were covered with crosses in different colors, with words like Jesus and angels scribbled everywhere. The windows were painted black, letting in no light. The place was damp, with yellow-stained carpets, dog feces, and cockroaches everywhere, though I never saw a dog. I politely asked her to keep it down, but she just looked at me, closed the door, and then turned the radio up even louder. The next night, my girlfriend stayed over. I woke up in the middle of the night to see a shadowy figure standing by the bed, watching us sleep. I thought I was hallucinating, as I sometimes do when I'm sleepy, but then the shadow spoke. It was my neighbor, and she was holding something in her hand. She had broken in during the night and could have been standing there for who knows how long. "You should lock your doors at night," she said before walking out. The next morning, I heard strange noises below my bedroom window. It was my neighbor, talking to herself in tongues. She had a plastic bag in her hand with her rotting dead dog inside. It was scorching outside, and the smell of death was overwhelming. At this point, I was terrified. She was clearly very disturbed. I went upstairs to knock on another neighbor's door and asked what was going on. The guy was as scared as I was. Apparently, she had broken into his apartment one evening as well. While he was watching TV with his kids, he got up from the couch to grab a snack, only to find her behind the couch, staring at him and holding a power drill. Thinking back, I now realize that's what she was holding when she stood by my bed. At this point, I'm absolutely terrified. I called the cops, and they seemed to know all about her. Apparently, she's a violent schizophrenic who hasn't been taking her meds, but the police can't force her to take them or enter her apartment without her permission since she owns it. The only thing they can do is wait for her to leave the apartment. I stayed up for the next 2 days, hoping she'd run out of cigarettes. When I finally heard her leave around 2 a.m. to go to the 7-Eleven across the road, I called the cops. Within 2 minutes, 3 police cars and a special van showed up. They restrained her, threw her in the van, and drove off to some institution. In less than a minute, it was like she was never there. I never saw her again, but I still have nightmares about her standing over me, watching me sleep. Number 2. I was about 15 minutes from finishing my night shift when I heard a massive crash coming from one of the office windows. I got up to check it out and saw that someone had thrown a pretty large rock through one of the front windows. What made it even stranger was that I was in the industrial district at 11:30 at night, with no other businesses open. I went back to my desk, quickly called security to report it, and decided to head home. As I was leaving the building, I started to freak myself out more and more, so I ended up running to my car, getting in, and speeding off. On my way home, I began to calm down when I suddenly realized I hadn't unlocked my car when I got in. It had been unlocked the whole time. I quickly reached back with my hand to check the back seat for any potential threats, but there was nothing there. About 30 minutes later, I called a friend who told me he was out drinking, so I decided to join him. I hopped on my bike and started riding over. It was a nice night, and I was in no rush, just enjoying the moonlight, when I heard someone riding behind me. I straightened up and moved to one side of the road. As he passed me, he did so really slowly, and when he was right beside me, he shot me a smile that I can only describe as completely insane. I flinched, taken aback, as he continued riding. That's when I realized he was riding my mom's bike. Needless to say, I sprinted home as fast as I could. When I got there, sure enough, her bike was missing, and one of my car's doors was open. The back left one. I had been driving and had no reason to open that door. Number one, I worked at a campground on the night shift, from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. each night. It wasn't too bad. I'd bring my PS2 and play games for most of the night, only dealing with one or two people on busy nights. I was alone in a tiny 8 by 8-foot shack, surrounded by darkness. During my first week, the other third shift guy, who was quitting, told me about a pay phone just a few feet from the shack. He said it rang every night at 4:17 a.m., just once. He thought it was probably an automated test call and had never answered it himself. I worked there for a few months. Since it was summer, I kept the windows closed most nights and couldn't hear the phone ring. In mid-August, I started leaving the windows open, and sure enough, the phone rang once at 4:17 a.m. each morning. The ring itself sounded eerie, like the payphone was submerged in water. One night, I got up the nerve to answer it. I set an alarm for 4:15, waited by the phone, and when it rang, I picked it up. There was no sound, just dead air, like someone was on the other line but not speaking. I said hello a few times before hanging up. I did this every night for a week with the same results, then stopped. In the first week of October, I decided to try again. I set my alarm and answered the phone as usual. This time, after repeatedly saying hello, I heard what sounded like someone inhaling through clenched teeth. The voice that came through was rough and sounded like it had gargled gravel. It said my full name, first, middle, and last. It was a voice I'd never heard before. My voice caught in my throat, and I hung up quickly. I rattled some change into the payphone and dialed *69. The number had come from California. I lived in Indiana,